80 years ago, during the final months of World War II, Captain James Mitchell and his 10-man crew aboard the B-29 Superfortress, Liberty's last stand, disappeared without leaving traces during a night bombing raid over Tokyo. Their absence plunged 11 American families into tragedy and silent mourning, while the military community and fellow airmen remained confused by the mystery. Military archives suggested hypotheses, but no conclusion was reached. The case fell into official oblivion, but the families never lost hope, fighting for the truth to emerge. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the bell. Here we reopen archived cases with respect and proof. The date was March 15, 1945. Dawn was still hours away when the alarm bells echoed through the barracks at Tinian Air Base in the Mariana Islands. Captain James Mitchell, a 26-year-old pilot from Columbus, Ohio, rolled out of his bunk with the practiced efficiency of a man who had flown 17 missions over Japan. His crew was already stirring. 10 young Americans who had become brothers in the aluminum belly of their B-29 Superfortress. Liberty's last stand wasn't just another bomber in the 20th Air Force. She was Mitchell's baby, a gleaming fortress of aluminum and steel that had carried them through the hell of war-torn skies 17 times and brought them home 17 times. The nose art depicted Lady Liberty holding a bomb instead of a torch, her face stern with determination. Mitchell had commissioned it after their 3rd mission, when they realized they weren't just dropping ordnance, they were delivering America's promise to end this war. The mission briefing that morning was routine by 1945 standards, yet ominous in its simplicity. Major William Hayes, the squadron intelligence officer, stood before a room filled with cigarette smoke and nervous tension. The target was Tokyo again, specifically the industrial district near the Sumida River. It would be a night raid, part of General Curtis LeMay's campaign to cripple Japan's war machine through strategic bombing. "Gentlemen," Major Hayes began, his voice cutting through the morning air, "tonight we're going back to Tokyo. Weather reports show clear skies over the target area, but expect flak concentrations around the industrial zones. Intelligence suggests enemy fighter activity has decreased, but remain vigilant. This could be one of our final major operations over the Japanese mainland." Mitchell listened with the attention of a professional, but his mind wandered to the letter he'd received from his wife Sarah 3 days earlier. She was pregnant with their 2nd child, and little Tommy was asking when Daddy would come home to help build the treehouse they'd planned before deployment. The weight of responsibility to his crew, his country, and his family pressed against his shoulders like invisible chains. Staff Sergeant Robert "Rusty" O'Brien, the flight engineer, was the oldest man on the crew at 28. He came from a family of mechanics in Detroit and could diagnose engine problems by sound alone. His hands, permanently stained with grease and hydraulic fluid, had kept Liberty's last stand flying when other planes had turned back with mechanical failures. Rusty had a photograph of his wife Margaret and their twin daughters taped above his workstation. He talked about opening a garage after the war, teaching his girls to fix engines just like their old man. Technical Sergeant David Chen, the radio operator, had joined the crew as a replacement after their original radio man was wounded over Osaka. Born in San Francisco to Chinese immigrants, Chen spoke fluent Mandarin and had become invaluable during intelligence-gathering flights. He was quiet, methodical, and had a gift for intercepting Japanese communications. His dream was to return to California and work for one of the emerging electronics companies he'd read about in magazines. The bombardier, 2nd Lieutenant Michael Romano from Brooklyn, was known for his precision and his inability to keep quiet during long flights. He'd grown up in Little Italy, where his family ran a small restaurant. Romano had promised his mother he'd come home and expand the family business, maybe open a 2nd location in Manhattan. His letters home were filled with detailed descriptions of the food he missed and recipes he wanted to try when the war ended. Navigator 1st Lieutenant William "Bill" Jackson was a former mathematics teacher from rural Kansas. He'd volunteered for the Air Force the day after Pearl Harbor, leaving behind a small schoolhouse where he'd taught algebra and geometry to farm children. Jackson's navigation skills had earned him commendations from higher command, and he'd successfully guided the crew through some of the most challenging weather conditions over the Pacific. He carried a compass that had belonged to his grandfather, a surveyor who'd helped map the Kansas territory. The gunners, Sergeant Thomas Murphy, Sergeant Frank Lopez, Sergeant Harold "Hank" Williams, Sergeant George Patterson, and Sergeant Anthony "Tony" Kowalski represented America's diversity. Murphy was an Irish-American from Boston who'd worked construction before the war. Lopez had grown up picking fruit in California's Central Valley. Williams was a farm boy from Alabama who'd never seen the ocean before shipping out to the Pacific. Patterson had been a factory worker in Pittsburgh, and Kowalski came from a Polish neighborhood in Chicago where his father worked in the steel mills. Each man carried stories, dreams, and the weight of unfinished business back home. They were united by training, shared danger, and the peculiar brotherhood that forms when men depend on each other for survival at 30,000 feet above enemy territory. As the briefing concluded, Mitchell gathered his crew around Liberty's last stand. The pre-flight inspection was more thorough than usual, not because of any specific concern, but because they all felt the weight of approaching war's end. Every mission now carried the terrible possibility of being the last one, the mission that would claim lives just before peace arrived. The engines roared to life as darkness settled over Tinian. Mitchell's hands moved across the controls with practiced precision, while Rusty monitored engine performance and Chen established radio contact with the tower. Romano checked his bombing equipment one final time, and Jackson plotted their course to Tokyo with mathematical precision. At 2147 hours, Liberty's last stand lifted off from runway Alpha, her engines thundering against the tropical night. She joined the formation of other B-29s, their navigation lights blinking like stars against the darkness. It was a sight that had become routine over the past months. American bombers heading toward Japan, carrying the war to the enemy's homeland. None of them knew that this routine night would become their final flight, that their families would spend decades waiting for answers that wouldn't come until a Japanese farmer made an impossible discovery nearly 80 years later. The formation of 12 B-29 Superfortresses climbed steadily through the darkness, their four-engine symphony echoing across the Pacific. Liberty's last stand held position in the formation's middle section, her crew settling into the familiar rhythm of a long-range mission. Captain Mitchell's voice crackled through the intercom system, calm and professional, despite the magnitude of their destination. "Navigator, time to target," Mitchell called out, his hands steady on the controls as they reached cruising altitude. 4 hours, 37 minutes to initial point over Tokyo Bay, sir," Lieutenant Jackson responded from his station, surrounded by charts and navigation equipment. The mathematics of death and destruction required precise calculations, wind speed, fuel consumption, bomb load weight, and the delicate balance between carrying enough ordnance to devastate the target and retaining enough fuel to return home. Technical Sergeant Chen monitored radio frequencies, listening for any change in mission parameters or warnings about enemy fighter activity. The static-filled channels carried fragments of conversations from other aircraft in the formation, weather updates from meteorological stations, and the occasional burst of Japanese communications that he dutifully recorded and translated for post-mission intelligence reports. Inside the bomber's aluminum fuselage, each crew member performed his assigned duties while battling the psychological weight of what lay ahead. At 30,000 feet, the temperature outside dropped to 40 degrees below zero, and the crew relied on heated flight suits and oxygen masks to survive in the thin atmosphere. The constant drone of engines became a mechanical lullaby that some men found comforting and others found maddening during the long hours over empty ocean. Sergeant Murphy, manning the upper turret gunner position, scanned the darkness for enemy fighters that intelligence reports suggested were becoming increasingly rare. Japan's air defenses had been systematically degraded over months of sustained bombing, but desperate enemies were often the most dangerous. Murphy had grown up hearing stories about World War I from his uncle, who'd survived the trenches in France, and he understood that wars became most brutal in their final stages. "Skipper, this is Chen. I'm picking up increased Japanese radio chatter. Sounds like they're tracking our formation," the radio operator reported, his voice steady despite the implications. Enemy tracking meant anti-aircraft defenses would be prepared, searchlights would sweep the sky, and any surviving fighters would be vectored toward the incoming bombers. Mitchell acknowledged the report without betraying concern to his crew. Leadership in combat required projecting confidence even when uncertainty gnawed at your stomach. He'd learned this lesson during their 7th mission, when engine failure had forced them to fly home on 3 engines while enemy fighters stalked their damaged bomber for over an hour. The crew had looked to him for reassurance, and he'd provided it while privately calculating their chances of survival. Lieutenant Romano, hunched over his bomb sight in the aircraft's nose section, made final adjustments to his equipment. The Norden bomb sight was a marvel of American engineering, capable of placing bombs within a few hundred feet of the target from altitudes that kept the aircraft relatively safe from ground-based defenses. Romano had trained extensively with the device, understanding that precision bombing could end the war faster than indiscriminate destruction of civilian areas. As they approached Japanese airspace, the formation tightened into combat configuration. Navigation lights were extinguished, and radio chatter was reduced to essential communications only. The darkness below gradually gave way to the faint glow of a city that had already endured months of bombing, but continued to function as Japan's industrial and political heart. Tokyo, in March 1945, was a city preparing for invasion. American intelligence estimated that Japanese forces were constructing defensive positions throughout the urban area, anticipating that the war would ultimately be decided in brutal street fighting. The civilian population had been mobilized for total resistance, with women and children trained to fight invading forces, with sharpened bamboo spears and improvised explosive devices. "Initial point in sight," Jackson announced as Tokyo Bay appeared beneath them, the water reflecting the pale moonlight that penetrated scattered clouds. The formation began its bombing run, following a precise flight path that would take them over the industrial targets while avoiding the heaviest concentrations of anti-aircraft defenses. Searchlights suddenly blazed to life across the city, their brilliant beams sweeping the sky in coordination with radar operators who tracked the approaching bombers. The lights created an almost theatrical effect, transforming the night into a deadly performance where American aircrew played their roles against Japanese defenders in a drama that would determine the fate of millions. "Flak ahead," reported Sergeant Lopez from his tail gunner position, watching explosions bloom in the darkness where anti-aircraft shells detonated at predetermined altitudes. The black bursts of shrapnel and smoke created a deadly obstacle course that pilots had to navigate while maintaining precise formation, flying and accurate bombing approaches. Romano's voice came through the intercom with professional calm. "Bomb bay doors open, 2 minutes to target." The mechanical sound of the bomb bay doors opening was followed by a subtle change in the aircraft's handling characteristics as wind resistance increased and the bomber's aerodynamics shifted. Below them, Tokyo stretched in all directions, a vast urban landscape that represented the heart of Japanese military-industrial capacity. Factories, shipyards, aircraft plants, and military installations were interspersed with civilian neighborhoods where families huddled in shelters, hoping to survive another night of American bombing. The weight of their mission pressed against each crew member's conscience. They were professional military personnel, conducting legal warfare against legitimate military targets, but the reality of strategic bombing meant that civilian casualties were inevitable. The moral complexity of their role would haunt some crew members long after the war ended, assuming they survived to grapple with such philosophical questions. "Bombs away," Romano announced as the aircraft lurched upward, suddenly lighter by several tons of high explosives. The bombardier watched through his sight as the ordnance fell toward the target area, calculating impact timing and assessing bombing accuracy for the post-mission report that would never be filed. Anti-aircraft fire intensified as the formation completed its bombing run and began the turn toward home. Searchlights tracked their movement while flak bursts created a deadly fireworks display around the bombers. Liberty's last stand shuddered as shrapnel fragments struck the fuselage, but the damage appeared minimal and the engines continued running smoothly. "Formation leader to all aircraft, we have successful target destruction. Form up for return flight." The command pilot's voice crackled through radio channels as the B-29s regrouped for the long journey back to Tinian. It was during this seemingly routine phase of the mission that Liberty's last stand began to fall behind the formation, her engines developing an irregular sound that Rusty O'Brien immediately recognized as trouble. Staff Sergeant Rusty O'Brien's trained ear detected the engine irregularity before any instruments registered the problem. 28 years of working with mechanical equipment had given him an almost supernatural ability to diagnose problems by sound, vibration, and the subtle changes in how machinery responded to operator inputs. What he heard from engine number 2 made his blood run cold. "Skipper, we've got a problem with number 2. Oil pressure is dropping and cylinder head temperature is climbing, O'Brien reported through the intercom, his voice steady despite the implications. Engine failure over enemy territory, hundreds of miles from friendly forces, was every aircrew's nightmare. Captain Mitchell immediately reduced power to the failing engine while scanning the instrument panel for additional warning signs. The formation was already several miles ahead, their navigation lights disappearing into the darkness as Liberty's last stand struggled to maintain altitude and airspeed with reduced power. Chen, notify formation leader that we're experiencing mechanical difficulties and falling behind, Mitchell ordered, while mentally calculating their options. Flying alone over Japanese territory would make them vulnerable to any remaining enemy fighters, but attempting to maintain formation speed with a failing engine could result in complete power plant failure and forced landing in enemy territory. Technical Sergeant Chen immediately began transmitting their situation to the formation leader, but his radio calls received no response. The communication equipment that had functioned perfectly during the bombing run now seemed unable to reach the other aircraft in their formation. Static filled the radio channels, punctuated by occasional bursts of Japanese communications that suggested enemy forces were tracking their isolated bomber. Formation leader, this is Liberty's last stand. We are experiencing engine failure and require immediate assistance. Please acknowledge, Chen repeated the transmission multiple times, adjusting frequencies and power settings in an attempt to re-establish contact with friendly forces. The silence from their own formation was more terrifying than enemy fire. Military doctrine emphasized that bombers operated most safely in formation, where multiple aircraft could provide mutual protection and shared navigation resources. A single bomber flying alone over enemy territory was vulnerable to fighter attack, anti-aircraft fire, and navigation errors that could prove fatal over the vast Pacific Ocean. Lieutenant Romano, monitoring the situation from his bombardier position, suggested they might be able to reach the formation by climbing to a higher altitude where radio transmission would be more effective. However, engine number 2 was continuing to lose power, and climbing would require increased performance from the remaining 3 engines, potentially causing additional mechanical failures. Navigator Bill Jackson was already calculating alternate courses of action. Their current position placed them approximately 400 miles from Tinian Air Base, with enough fuel to reach friendly territory if they maintained optimal flight configuration. However, the failing engine was consuming fuel at an increased rate while producing reduced power, and Japanese territory stretched beneath them for another 2 hours of flight time. Rusty, what's your assessment of number 2? Can we nurse it home? Mitchell asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. O'Brien's expression told the story before he spoke. Sir, the oil pressure is continuing to drop and metal particles are appearing in the oil. If we push it too hard, we'll lose the engine completely and there's a risk of fire. I recommend we reduce power to minimum settings and hope it holds together long enough to get us over water, O'Brien replied, his expertise carrying the weight of 11 lives. The decision to continue flying with a failing engine while separated from their formation would haunt the families of Liberty's last stand for decades. Military investigators would later question whether Mitchell should have attempted an emergency landing in Japanese territory, where the crew might have survived as prisoners of war, rather than risking the long flight over hostile territory and open ocean. Sergeant Murphy, scanning the darkness from his upper turret position, reported seeing searchlights tracking their aircraft from multiple ground positions. Enemy forces were obviously aware of their mechanical difficulties and isolated position. Japanese night fighters, though rare by 1945, still posed a significant threat to a lone bomber flying predictable courses at reduced speed. Contact bearing 270 degrees, approximately 5 miles, Murphy announced, as he spotted navigation lights that didn't match the configuration of American aircraft. The contact was closing on their position, suggesting either enemy fighter aircraft or possibly one of their own formation aircraft returning to assist. Chen attempted to establish radio communication with the approaching aircraft, broadcasting both American identification codes and emergency frequencies. The response came in heavily accented English. American bomber, you will change course to bearing 090 degrees and descend to 15,000 feet for landing at designated airfield. The crew of Liberty's last stand now faced an impossible decision. Following the instructions might result in capture and imprisonment, but continuing their current course with a failing engine over hostile territory offered little chance of survival if additional mechanical problems developed. Mitchell had seconds to decide the fate of his crew. All crew members, prepare for evasive action. We're not surrendering to enemy fighters, Mitchell announced, pushing the throttles forward despite O'Brien's warnings about engine stress. The B-29 responded sluggishly, burdened by mechanical problems and the inherent limitations of flying on reduced power. The pursuing aircraft, later identified as a Kawasaki Ki-45 Nick night fighter, opened fire with cannon and machine gun rounds that traced through the darkness like deadly fireworks. Sergeant Lopez, manning the tail guns, returned fire while calling out the enemy fighter's position and attack angle. The engagement lasted only minutes, but those minutes would determine whether 11 American families would ever learn the truth about their loved ones' final moments. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are hearing this story. We are interested in knowing how far and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. Engine number 2 finally seized completely during the aerial combat, its internal components literally welding themselves together from excessive heat and lack of lubrication. The sudden loss of power caused Liberty's last stand to enter an uncontrollable descent, while the remaining 3 engines struggled to maintain level flight. Mayday, mayday! This is Liberty's last stand. We are going down approximately 100 miles southeast of Tokyo. Any stations reading this transmission, please relay to Tinian Air Base, Chen transmitted repeatedly as the bomber descended through the darkness toward the Japanese countryside below. The radio messages were never acknowledged by friendly forces, and the location of Liberty's last stand became one of the war's unsolved mysteries. For 79 years, the families of Captain Mitchell and his crew would wait for answers that official military channels seemed unable or unwilling to provide. Sarah Mitchell stood on the front porch of her Columbus, Ohio home, watching the mailman approach with the same desperate hope that had sustained her for 3 months. The official telegram from the War Department had arrived on March 22, 1945, exactly 7 days after Liberty's last stand had failed to return to Tinian Air Base. The message was brief, clinical, and devastating. We regret to inform you that your husband, Captain James Mitchell, has been reported missing in action over Japan. Missing in action. 3 words that offered neither closure nor hope, creating a liminal space where grief couldn't properly begin and healing remained impossible. Sarah carried their unborn child while caring for 4-year-old Tommy, who asked every morning when Daddy would come home to build the treehouse they had planned before deployment. The military's official correspondence provided no additional information beyond the basic facts. Captain Mitchell's aircraft had failed to return from a combat mission over Japan, no distress signals had been received, and search efforts had been unsuccessful. The letters that followed used increasingly bureaucratic language to explain why no additional details could be provided about the circumstances of his disappearance. Margaret O'Brien received similar notification about her husband, Rusty, at their Detroit home, where she was raising twin daughters who barely remembered their father. The War Department's telegram arrived while she was teaching the girls to read, using the letters Rusty had sent from the Pacific as practice material. His last letter, written the day before the final mission, described his plans for the garage he wanted to open after the war and his excitement about teaching his daughters to work on automobiles. "Daddy writes funny letters," 6-year-old Mary O'Brien commented, pointing to her father's distinctive handwriting. "Why doesn't he write anymore?" Margaret found herself unable to answer questions that implied a finality she couldn't accept. Missing in action suggested the possibility of survival, capture, or eventual return. Hope became both salvation and torture for military families who received no definitive answers about their loved ones' fates. The Romano family restaurant in Brooklyn became a shrine to Second Lieutenant Michael Romano's memory, though his mother refused to acknowledge that memory implied death. She continued setting a place for him at the family dinner table, preparing his favorite dishes, and telling customers that her son would return from the war to help expand the business. The other family members eventually stopped contradicting her public statements, understanding that hope was sometimes the only alternative to despair. Mrs. Chen received her notification in San Francisco, where she had been planning a welcome home celebration for David's anticipated return in the summer of 1945. The Chinese-American community had supported her throughout the war, organizing letter-writing campaigns and care package drives for their servicemen overseas. David's disappearance became their shared tragedy, a reminder that war's cruelty transcended racial and ethnic boundaries. The families of the gunners, Murphy, Lopez, Williams, Patterson, and Kowalski, represented a cross-section of American society united by grief and frustration. Each household developed its own coping mechanisms for dealing with uncertainty. Some families maintained normal routines, acting as if their sons and husbands would return at any moment. Others began mourning processes while simultaneously hoping for miraculous survival. Mrs. Williams in Alabama refused to believe her son Hank was dead until she received definitive proof. Rural communities had their own informal networks for sharing information about local servicemen, and conflicting stories circulated about possible prisoner of war camps where missing airmen might be held. Every rumor became a lifeline for families desperate for any news about their loved ones. The Jackson family in Kansas faced particular challenges because Bill had been their community's primary mathematics teacher before volunteering for military service. Parents throughout the county had trusted him with their children's education, and his disappearance left both personal and professional voids. The small schoolhouse where he had taught remained partially empty, with no qualified replacement available during wartime teacher shortages. Tony Kowalski's family in Chicago organized neighborhood searches through Red Cross channels, hoping to locate other crew members who might have survived and been captured. Polish-American communities had established extensive networks for tracking servicemen through various official and unofficial sources, but their efforts yielded no information about Liberty's last stand or any of its crew members. Frank Lopez's family in California's Central Valley faced additional challenges because their agricultural community included many families of Japanese ancestry who had been relocated to internment camps. The irony of Frank dying while fighting Japan, while Japanese-American families suffered discrimination at home, created complex emotional conflicts within their community. As months passed without additional information, the families began organizing their own investigation efforts. Sarah Mitchell contacted wives of other crew members, sharing the limited information each family had received from official sources. They discovered that all families had received identical notification letters with no specific details about the mission, the circumstances of the disappearance, or the military search efforts. The wives organized letter-writing campaigns to military officials, congressional representatives, and newspaper editors, demanding more information about their husband's final mission. Their efforts generated sympathetic responses, but no additional factual details. Military censorship during wartime prevented the release of operational information that might compromise ongoing missions or reveal strategic capabilities to enemy forces. We understand your concern for your loved ones, but operational security requirements prevent us from discussing specific mission details while combat operations continue, became the standard response to family inquiries. This bureaucratic language provided legal protection for military officials while offering no comfort to families seeking answers. The end of the war in August 1945 brought celebration throughout America, but the families of Liberty's last stand found victory bittersweet. Other servicemen returned home to parades and family reunions, while their loved ones remained missing without explanation. Post-war military reorganization created additional bureaucratic obstacles as files were transferred between different agencies and personnel with knowledge of specific missions were reassigned or discharged. Sarah Mitchell gave birth to her daughter Rebecca in August 1945, naming her after James's mother, who had died before the war. Rebecca would grow up knowing her father only through photographs, letters, and stories, joining the thousands of American children who became tangible reminders of war's personal costs. The families maintained correspondence with each other for years after the war, sharing holidays, birthdays, and the milestones their loved ones would miss. Children graduated from school, got married, and had children of their own while their fathers remained frozen in time as young men who had volunteered to serve their country and never returned home. By 1950, most families had exhausted their appeals through official channels. Military officials acknowledged the disappearance of Liberty's last stand, but maintained that no additional information was available. The case was officially classified as missing in action, presumed dead, allowing families to receive death benefits while providing no closure about the actual circumstances of their loved one's fate. The silence from official sources became more painful than the original loss, suggesting that bureaucratic indifference had replaced wartime necessity as the primary obstacle to truth and accountability. The bureaucratic maze that military families encountered when seeking information about missing servicemen revealed systemic problems within the War Department that would persist for decades after World War II ended. Sarah Mitchell's correspondence files, carefully preserved in a manila folder that grew thicker each year, documented her increasingly desperate attempts to extract meaningful information from official sources. Colonel Robert Harrison, assigned to the Army Air Force's Casualty Division, became the primary point of contact for families of Liberty's Last Stand crew members. His letters, written in formal military language, consistently provided the same limited information. The aircraft had failed to return from a combat mission, no distress signals had been received, and search efforts had been unsuccessful due to operational constraints. Mrs. Mitchell, I understand your desire for additional information about your husband's final mission. However, operational security considerations prevent the release of specific details that might compromise ongoing intelligence activities or reveal strategic capabilities, Colonel Harrison wrote in a letter dated September 15, 1945, 3 weeks after Japan's surrender. The persistence of operational security claims after the war's end suggested that bureaucratic convenience had replaced legitimate security concerns as the primary reason for withholding information from grieving families. Military officials found it easier to maintain blanket secrecy policies rather than reviewing individual cases and releasing information that posed no genuine security risks. Margaret O'Brien, drawing upon her experience as a factory worker during the war, understood bureaucratic procedures better than most military wives. She organized a systematic campaign to contact every official who might have access to information about her husband's disappearance. Her letters went to base commanders, intelligence officers, aircraft accident investigators, and personnel officers who might have processed casualty reports. The responses revealed a disturbing pattern. No single office accepted responsibility for investigating the disappearance of Liberty's Last Stand, and each agency referred families to other agencies that also disclaimed authority or knowledge. The crew had disappeared somewhere between official bureaucratic jurisdictions, creating a situation where no one was accountable for providing answers to families. Mrs. Romano's attempts to contact survivors of other missions flown on March 15, 1945, yielded frustrating results. She located 3 other crew members who had flown in the same formation as Liberty's Last Stand, but they had been ordered not to discuss mission details with civilians, including family members of missing servicemen. Military regulations prohibited servicemen from revealing operational information, even to help families understand what had happened to their loved ones. The families discovered that several other B-29 crews had been reported missing during the same time period, suggesting that March 1945 had been particularly costly for American bomber operations over Japan. However, information about these other disappearances was equally restricted, preventing families from identifying patterns that might explain their loved ones' fates. David Chen's mother contacted the Chinese consulate in San Francisco, hoping that diplomatic channels might provide access to information about American prisoners held in Japan or China. Consular officials expressed sympathy, but explained that their own information about prisoner of war camps was limited and unreliable. Many Japanese military records had been destroyed during the final months of the war, making comprehensive prisoner accounting nearly impossible. The Jackson family in Kansas benefited from their community's political connections when Senator Arthur Capper agreed to make official inquiries about Bill Jackson's disappearance. Senator Capper's office received detailed briefings from War Department officials, but the information was classified and couldn't be shared with the family. The senator's staff could only confirm that official agencies were aware of the case and claimed to be conducting ongoing investigations. I wish I could provide more specific information about your son's situation, but military authorities have classified the details of his final mission. I can assure you that appropriate officials are reviewing all available evidence, Senator Capper wrote to Bill's parents in March 1946, nearly a year after the disappearance. The Murphy family in Boston organized community support through their Catholic parish, which had lost several other young men during the war. Father Michael O'Malley, the parish priest, contacted military chaplains who might have access to casualty information through religious channels. Military chaplains expressed sympathy, but explained that they received no additional information beyond what was provided to families through official casualty notification procedures. The Williams family in Alabama faced particular challenges because rural communities had limited access to legal resources that might help navigate military bureaucracy. Hank's father, a subsistence farmer, barely understood the complex forms and procedures required to file appeals or request additional information. Local American Legion representatives provided assistance, but they had no special access to classified military records. Tony Kowalski's family in Chicago benefited from their community's political organization and ethnic networks. Polish-American political leaders had established relationships with military officials through wartime recruitment and support activities. However, these connections yielded no additional information about Liberty's last stand, suggesting that the case was either genuinely lost in bureaucratic confusion or deliberately being suppressed for reasons that weren't explained to families. Frank Lopez's family in California discovered that Mexican-American families faced additional obstacles when dealing with military bureaucracy. Language barriers, cultural differences, and socio-economic factors made it more difficult for some families to navigate the complex procedures required to request information or file appeals. Community organizations provided assistance, but they couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of military secrecy policies. By 1947, the families had exhausted most official channels without receiving meaningful additional information. The Cold War's emergence created new security concerns that military officials used to justify continued secrecy about wartime operations. Information that might have been declassified during the immediate post-war period remained classified indefinitely due to concerns about Soviet intelligence activities. The families began to suspect that military authorities either didn't know what had happened to Liberty's last stand or knew information that they preferred not to reveal. Both possibilities were disturbing, suggesting either institutional incompetence or deliberate deception of grieving families who deserved honest answers about their loved ones' fates. Sarah Mitchell's final letter to military authorities, written in December 1949, reflected the exhaustion and frustration that characterized most families' experiences. I have spent 4 years asking simple questions about my husband's disappearance and have received no meaningful answers. I am forced to conclude that military authorities either don't know what happened to Captain Mitchell and his crew, or know information that they refuse to share with families who have the right to understand how our loved ones died in service to their country. The silence that followed this letter would persist for 75 more years, until a discovery in the mountains of Japan finally provided the answers that official sources had withheld from families who deserved better treatment from the institutions their loved ones had died serving. The decades following World War II transformed the families of Liberty's last stand from grieving military dependents into reluctant experts on bureaucratic obstruction and institutional memory loss. Their children grew up in households where absent fathers remained vivid presences through photographs, letters, and stories that became more precious as official sources continued providing no answers. Tommy Mitchell, who had been 4 years old when his father disappeared, developed an obsession with aviation that his mother Sarah initially encouraged as a healthy way to maintain connection with his missing father. By age 16, Tommy was building model aircraft and studying aeronautical engineering, driven by an unconscious hope that understanding flight might somehow explain what had happened to Captain James Mitchell and the crew of Liberty's last stand. "Mum, why won't they tell us where Dad's plane went down? If they know enough to declare him dead, they must know something about what happened," Tommy asked during one of their regular conversations about his father. Sarah had no satisfactory answer, because military authorities had never provided a satisfactory explanation. Rebecca Mitchell, born 4 months after her father's final mission, grew up with a different relationship to his absence. She knew James Mitchell only through family stories and the accumulated mythology that develops around missing persons. Her father became simultaneously idealized and unknowable, a perfect man who existed only in memory and imagination. The O'Brien twins, Mary and Patricia, developed contrasting responses to their father's disappearance. Mary maintained hope that Rusty might still be alive in some remote location, while Patricia accepted his death, but remained angry about the military's failure to provide details about his final mission. Both women pursued careers that involved helping other families navigate bureaucratic systems. Mary became a social worker, and Patricia became a paralegal specializing in veterans affairs. Michael Romano's younger brother, Anthony, took over the family restaurant in Brooklyn, maintaining the tradition of setting a place for Michael at holiday dinners long after their mother had died. The restaurant became an unofficial gathering place for other Italian-American families who had lost sons during the war, creating a community of shared grief and mutual support. The Chen family's experience illustrated how ethnic minority families faced additional challenges when dealing with military bureaucracy. David's mother never fully mastered English, making it difficult for her to pursue appeals or understand the limited information she received from official sources. Her son's disappearance became entangled with broader issues of discrimination and cultural misunderstanding that persisted well into the post-war period. Bill Jackson's former students in Kansas grew up wondering what had happened to their mathematics teacher, who had volunteered to serve his country. Some of them pursued military careers themselves, hoping to find information about Jackson's fate through service connections. Others became teachers, carrying forward his educational legacy while maintaining interest in solving the mystery of his disappearance. The families maintained correspondence with each other throughout the 1950s and 1960s, sharing information about their efforts to contact military authorities and any rumors or stories they heard about missing servicemen from World War II. These letters created an informal archive of their investigation efforts and documented the evolution of their thinking about what might have happened to their loved ones. Sergeant Murphy's family in Boston became involved with emerging prisoner of war advocacy organizations during the Korean War, when new cases of missing servicemen highlighted the government's inadequate procedures for accounting for military personnel. They hoped that improved policies might eventually lead to renewed investigation of World War II cases like Liberty's Last Stand. The Williams family in Alabama faced economic challenges that made it difficult to maintain their search for information about Hank's fate. Rural poverty limited their access to legal resources, long-distance communication, and travel that might have helped them pursue leads or contact other families. Their experience illustrated how socioeconomic factors influenced families' ability to seek answers about missing servicemen. Tony Kowalski's family in Chicago benefited from their ethnic community's political organization and established networks for helping families deal with government agencies. However, even these advantages couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of military secrecy policies that prevented the release of operational information. Polish-American political leaders confirmed that they had no special access to classified military records. Frank Lopez's family in California discovered connections with other Mexican-American families whose sons had disappeared during the war. They organized informal support groups and shared strategies for dealing with military bureaucracy, but their collective efforts yielded no additional information about any of the missing servicemen. Their experience suggested that Liberty's Last Stand was part of a larger pattern of unexplained disappearances. The 1970s brought renewed interest in World War II history as veterans began sharing stories they had kept private for decades. Several families of Liberty's Last Stand crew members contacted military historians and aviation enthusiasts who were researching specific battles and operations. These researchers had access to some declassified records, but found no additional information about the bomber's final mission. Military historians confirmed that March 1945 had been a particularly active period for B-29 operations over Japan, with multiple missions flown against strategic targets during the final months of the war. However, detailed records of individual missions remained classified, and many operational documents had been destroyed during post-war reorganization of military agencies. If this case has already captivated you, please leave a like. This helps the story of Captain James Mitchell and his crew reach more people. Aviation archaeology emerged as a specialized field during the 1980s, when researchers began systematic efforts to locate crashed aircraft from World War II. Several families contacted these researchers, hoping that physical evidence might eventually be discovered in Japan or the Pacific Ocean. The researchers expressed interest, but explained that searching for specific aircraft required precise location information that wasn't available in the case of Liberty's last stand. The development of computer databases and improved record management systems during the 1990s raised hopes that previously inaccessible military records might be digitized and made available to researchers and families. However, the families discovered that many World War II operational records had been destroyed or lost during various bureaucratic reorganizations, making comprehensive investigation of individual cases extremely difficult. DNA identification technology offered new possibilities for identifying remains of missing servicemen, but required physical evidence that could be tested. The families provided DNA samples to military identification laboratories, hoping that someday remains or personal effects might be discovered and require identification. These samples remained on file for decades without being matched to any discovered evidence. The 50th anniversary of World War II's end in 1995 generated renewed public interest in wartime stories and military history. Several families participated in commemorative events and media interviews, sharing their stories and asking for information that might help solve the mystery of Liberty's last stand. These publicity efforts generated sympathy, but no new information about the bomber's fate. Sarah Mitchell died in 1998, 53 years after her husband's disappearance, without ever learning what had happened to him. Her children inherited her correspondence files, photograph collections, and the unresolved grief that had shaped their family's identity for more than 5 decades. They continued pursuing answers, driven partly by their mother's example and partly by their own need for closure. The new millennium brought internet resources that allowed researchers to share information more easily and connect with others interested in similar cases. Online databases of missing servicemen, military history forums, and aviation archaeology websites provided new venues for sharing information and organizing search efforts. However, these resources couldn't overcome the fundamental problem of absent or classified official records. The children and grandchildren of Liberty's last stand crew members entered the 21st century with inherited mysteries that had shaped their families for nearly 60 years. They represented the second and third generations of Americans whose lives had been permanently altered by bureaucratic secrecy and institutional indifference to family grief. Their persistence would eventually be rewarded, though none of them could have imagined that the answers they sought would finally emerge from the discovery of a Japanese farmer working in a remote mountain valley, nearly 8 decades after their loved ones had disappeared into the darkness above Tokyo. March 12, 2024, began as an ordinary day for Hiroshi Tanaka, a 67-year-old farmer whose family had worked the same mountain valley in Ibaraki Prefecture for 4 generations. The winter had been particularly harsh, and the spring thaw was revealing unusual objects in his fields that he had never noticed during his 40 years of farming, the land inherited from his father. Tanaka was preparing seedbeds for the spring planting season when his tractor struck something metallic, buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. Such discoveries were not uncommon in rural Japan, where farmers occasionally unearthed artillery shells, equipment fragments, or other debris from World War II. However, the object that emerged from Tanaka's field was larger and more complex than typical wartime artifacts. The initial discovery consisted of what appeared to be part of an aircraft engine, heavily corroded, but still recognizable to anyone familiar with aviation equipment. Tanaka, whose grandfather had witnessed American bombing raids during the war, immediately suspected that he had found wreckage from one of the aircraft that had crashed in the area during 1945. Rather than simply reburying the object, as many farmers had done with similar discoveries over the decades, Tanaka contacted local authorities who were responsible for handling wartime artifacts. The Ibaraki Prefecture Archaeological Preservation Office had established procedures for investigating such discoveries, particularly when they might be related to missing servicemen from any nation. Dr. Kenji Yamamoto, an archaeologist specializing in World War II sites, arrived at Tanaka's farm 3 days after the initial discovery. Dr. Yamamoto had investigated dozens of aircraft crash sites throughout Japan, helping to identify remains and personal effects that could provide closure to families whose loved ones had been missing for decades. The engine appears to be from an American B-29 bomber, based on its size and construction characteristics, Dr. Yamamoto explained to Tanaka as they examined the initial discovery. These aircraft were involved in strategic bombing missions over Japan during the final months of the war. If this is indeed B-29 wreckage, there should be additional debris in the surrounding area. A systematic archaeological excavation of Tanaka's field began in late March 2024, using ground-penetrating radar and metal detectors to identify subsurface anomalies that might represent aircraft wreckage. The investigation revealed a debris field extending over approximately 2 acres, suggesting that the aircraft had broken apart during impact rather than burning completely. The excavation team discovered multiple aircraft components, including sections of fuselage, landing gear assemblies, and what appeared to be parts of the aircraft's defensive armament systems. The preservation of these artifacts was remarkable, considering that they had been buried for nearly 80 years in soil conditions that typically accelerated metal corrosion. Dr. Yamamoto's most significant discovery occurred during the 3rd week of excavation, when his team uncovered a section of the aircraft's fuselage that contained partially legible identification numbers and markings. The numbers, though corroded and difficult to read, appeared to match records of American aircraft that had been reported missing during World War II. We have found what appears to be the serial number 4469847, which corresponds to a B-29 Superfortress that was reported missing in action during March 1945. Dr. Yamamoto reported to military attachés at the American Embassy in Tokyo. If this identification is accurate, we may have located the wreckage of an aircraft whose crew has been missing for nearly 8 decades. The American military's Joint POW MIA Accounting Command, JPAC, responded immediately to Dr. Yamamoto's report, dispatching a team of specialists to verify the discovery and determine whether human remains might be present at the site. JPAC had been established specifically to investigate cases of missing American servicemen and provide closure to families who had waited decades for answers. Technical analysis of the aircraft components confirmed Dr. Yamamoto's initial assessment. The wreckage belonged to a B-29 Superfortress that had crashed in March 1945. The serial number matched records of Liberty's Last Stand, the bomber that had disappeared during a night raid over Tokyo with Captain James Mitchell and 10 crew members aboard. The excavation team discovered personal effects that had been preserved in the aircraft's wreckage, including dog tags, uniform insignia, and personal items that could be linked to specific crew members. These artifacts provided the first physical evidence of what had happened to the 11 American servicemen who had vanished into the darkness above Japan nearly 80 years earlier. DNA analysis of bone fragments found at the site confirmed the presence of human remains that matched genetic samples provided by family members over the previous decades. The positive identifications represented the culmination of the longest-running missing persons case in American military history, finally providing definitive answers to questions that had haunted 11 families for nearly a lifetime. Captain James Mitchell's dog tags were among the personal effects recovered from the wreckage, along with a partially preserved photograph of his wife Sarah and son Tommy. The photograph, protected by Mitchell's leather wallet, had survived 8 decades buried in Japanese soil, creating a tangible connection between the missing pilot and the family who had never stopped searching for answers about his fate. Staff Sergeant Rusty O'Brien's toolbox was discovered in the section of wreckage that had once been the flight engineer's station. The tools, though corroded, were still recognizable as the specialized equipment used to maintain B-29 engines during World War II. O'Brien's mechanical expertise, which had kept Liberty's Last Stand flying through 17 previous missions, was represented by the instruments he had used to diagnose the engine failure that had ultimately led to the aircraft's destruction. Technical Sergeant David Chen's radio equipment was found in relatively good condition, providing evidence of the crew's final communications attempts. The radio components suggested that Chen had been trying to transmit emergency signals when the aircraft crashed, confirming that the crew had survived the initial engine failure and attempted to reach friendly forces before their final mission ended in the mountains of Japan. The personal effects of the gunners, Murphy, Lopez, Williams, Patterson, and Kowalski, were discovered throughout the wreckage, telling individual stories of young men who had died far from home while serving their country. Sergeant Murphy's rosary beads, Sergeant Williams's compass, and Sergeant Patterson's photographs of his family created intimate portraits of the human cost of strategic bombing operations over Japan. Lieutenant Romano's bombardier equipment was recovered from the aircraft's nose section, along with maps and navigation instruments that documented the crew's final mission. The bombing equipment had been jettisoned before the crash, suggesting that Romano had followed emergency procedures in an attempt to reduce the aircraft's weight and improve its chances of survival. Navigator Bill Jackson's flight logs and mathematical calculations were preserved in a waterproof case that had protected them from decades of soil contamination. Jackson's precise navigation records provided a detailed account of Liberty's last stand's final mission, including the engine failure that had forced them to separate from their formation and the attempts to reach friendly territory that had ultimately failed. The discovery of Liberty's last stand represented more than the solution to a single missing persons case. The wreckage provided physical evidence of the human cost of strategic bombing operations during World War II, while the preserved personal effects created tangible connections between historical events and individual human experiences. Hiroshi Tanaka's accidental discovery had finally provided answers to questions that military authorities had been unable or unwilling to address for nearly 8 decades. The farmer's decision to contact archaeologists rather than simply reburying the wreckage had given 11 American families the closure they had sought throughout their lifetimes. The preservation of personal documents and artifacts within the wreckage of Liberty's last stand created an unprecedented opportunity to reconstruct the aircraft's final hours through the eyes of its crew members. Dr. Yamamoto's archaeological team worked with American military specialists to carefully extract and preserve materials that had survived 8 decades buried in Japanese soil. Captain James Mitchell's flight log, discovered in a waterproof case designed to protect navigation documents during emergency situations, contained his handwritten account of the engine failure and the crew's attempts to reach friendly territory. Mitchell's final entries, written in the controlled handwriting of a professional pilot facing an emergency, provided the most detailed account available of the aircraft's last mission. 15:47 hours, engine number 2 showing decreased oil pressure and increased cylinder head temperature. Rusty reports metal particles in oil sample, reducing power to minimum sustainable settings, Mitchell had written, documenting the beginning of the mechanical crisis that would ultimately doom his aircraft and crew. The flight log continued with technical details about the crew's attempts to maintain formation with the other bombers in their group, the decision to continue toward friendly territory despite mechanical problems, and the encounter with Japanese night fighters that had accelerated their aircraft's final descent. 16:12 hours, formation leader not responding to radio calls. Chen reports communication equipment functioning properly, but unable to establish contact with friendly forces. We are proceeding alone toward Tinian with engine number 2 at minimum power settings. Mitchell's entries documented the isolation that had made Liberty's last stand vulnerable to enemy attack. Staff Sergeant Rusty O'Brien's maintenance log, recovered from his toolbox, provided technical details about the engine failure that military investigators had been unable to reconstruct from official records alone. O'Brien's expertise allowed him to diagnose the specific mechanical problems that had caused engine number 2 to fail during the most critical phase of their mission. Engine number 2, main bearing failure, probably caused by oil pump malfunction during high-power climb over target area. Metal contamination throughout oil system suggests internal damage too extensive for in-flight repair. Recommended immediate shutdown to prevent fire hazard, O'Brien had written, describing the mechanical crisis with the precision of an experienced aircraft maintenance specialist. Technical Sergeant David Chen's communication logs, preserved along with his radio equipment, revealed the crew's desperate attempts to establish contact with friendly forces during their final flight. Chen had recorded multiple transmission attempts on different frequencies, all unsuccessful due to distance, atmospheric conditions, or enemy interference.